So after Albrecht Dürer finished the Trinity altarpiece, he did no paintings of the sort that get into most art history books for over a decade, but that doesn't mean he was idle. Between 1513 and 1514, he made 3 engravings which are always considered among the most important in the history of their medium. And you see one of these now, The Night, Devil, and Death. Dürer is not only the greatest engraver, he is one of the first engravers. The earliest surviving copperplate engravings were made about 1450, so the method was still very new in his day. Most of Dürer's prints with religious subjects were made with wood blocks, and as I mentioned earlier, these were usually not cut by Dürer himself, but by specialists who made them from his drawings. He did, however, cut his own copper plates and usually used them for more secular or humanistic subjects. It's possible that The Night, Devil, and Death was inspired by the Enchiridion Milites Christiani of Erasmus, the manual of the Christian knight, in which it is argued that the Christian must go through life like a soldier, armored with his faith against fear and temptation. But like many great works of art, it has been the subject of a lot of different interpretations. Here's the night up closer, and in this detail you can get some idea of the technical expertise demanded by this kind of work. The whole engraving is smaller than a page in a book. The design was cut using a kind of steel needle called a burin. When the plate was finished, an ink-soaked cloth was passed over it, the ink settling in the cuts. A clean cloth was then used to wipe the plate, leaving the ink in the cuts, which was then transferred to absorbent paper pressed down on the plate, and dozens to hundreds of copies could be made in this way. This is the engraving by Dürer called Melancholia I, as though there was supposed to have perhaps been a second, a Melancholia II. More has been written about this strange work than about almost anything else in the history of German art. The usual view is that the figure represents something like the soul, or human spirit, which is surrounded by things apparently representing worldly knowledge, science, and accomplishment. Some see it as a more personal statement, a sort of spiritual self-portrait in which the genius of Dürer is surrounded by the tools of creation. In any case, the figure is clearly depressed, as though the point is that neither science nor art can be ultimately satisfying. In the absence, the suggestion would seem to be, of faith. One has to be reminded by this of Goethe's Faust, I think, who has mastered worldly knowledge, but ultimately what good is it? Da steh ich nur, ich armer Tor elements, and bin so klug als wie zuvor. Here I sit, poor fool me, no wiser than I used to be. That is, about what will bring real psychic satisfaction. The third of the great engravings of 1513 and 1514 is St. Jerome in his study, and this was often sold by Dürer with Melancholia I as a pair, as though he meant there to be a connection between them. And it may well be that the point here is that Jerome is the contented Christian scholar, securely satisfied in spirit, in contradistinction to the brooding secular humanist in Melancholia I. The atmosphere is certainly very different in this gemütlich, sunlit study in which even the memento mori, the skull by the window, and the saint's pet lion don't even look threatening. In 1512, Dürer had met the Emperor Maximilian during one of the latter's visits to Nuremberg, and he painted this portrait of him, although it wasn't finished until several years later after the Emperor's death. In the Latin at the top, Maximilian is credited with just about every virtue known to man. He was brave, wise, magnanimous, and so on. He did love tournaments of various sorts, and his devotion to the trappings and ceremonies of chivalry led him to be called the last of the knights by his contemporaries. His efforts to pass as the arbiter of European politics did not meet with success, however, nor did his most hopelessly big goal in life, which was to unite the political and Christian worlds by becoming the head of the church. Charmingly but over-optimistically, he used to sign his letters to his daughter, "Your Father Max, future Pope." He was also interested in all the arts, and when he concluded that the giant monumental arch on the model of those by his predecessors like Trajan and Hadrian, which he wanted, would never be built, he decided on a giant paper arch instead, complete with a triumphal procession. And Durr was commissioned to supervise the overall project, with Pirkheimer to act as advisor in matters of scholarship and iconography. It may be that Durr didn't want to do large painting projects after the Trinity altarpiece, but this became the largest thing of its kind ever undertaken, and required 92 wood blocks and years of on and off work by him as nominal supervisor. Hans Birkmeyer of Augsburg, another artist on Maximilian's payroll, probably should get more credit for it though, and at least cut more of the blocks than anyone else. This is the arch, which was the centerpiece of the whole thing. It's decorated with pictures of a lot of the most famous people from whom Maximilian imagined he was descended, including such variously virtued heroes as Hercules and Moses, Alexander the Great, and Osiris. Himself cut the block depicting the main float in the procession, on which the Emperor and his wife Mary of Burgundy are riding. As I said, Maximilian never became the Europe-wide authority figure he wanted to be, but the marriage of his son Philip the Handsome to Juana, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, made his grandson and successor, Charles V, heir to most of continental Europe outside France, not to mention the fact that papal fiat gave him almost the whole Western Hemisphere as well. Durr also undertook several other smaller-scale projects for the Emperor. He contributed illustrations for 45 of the pages in the Emperor's prayer book, now in the Hofburg Library in Vienna, for example, and several other artists, including Albrecht Altdorfer, Lucas Cranach, and Durer's pupil, Hans Baldung, also illustrated pages, making this book a veritable pocket museum of German Renaissance graphic art. The Vienna Art History Museum has what is called the Dürer Goblet on the assumption that it was made, possibly for Maximilian, from a design by him, and there certainly are sketches by him that depict goblets that are very similar to this, and it was made in Nuremberg. The greatest bronze sculptor in Durer's day in Germany was the Nuremberg artist Peter Fischer, who made the tomb of St. Sebaldus, which you see here now in the church of the same name. Although a bit old-fashioned and Gothic in style in part, certainly, it is a very impressive thing. It's a bit surprising, considering that Germany, and Nuremberg in particular, were known for metalwork, that there was little sculpture done there in bronze which gets into the standard texts. Instead, Nuremberg became famous for producing technology in metal. Things like navigational equipment and measuring devices, printing presses, clocks, and even miniature clocks called Nuremberg eggs, although Maximilian complained that his never worked right, and so on. It's sometimes said that what can be called the first industrial exposition was held in Nuremberg in 1568. Here's a self-portrait of Fischer among the figures on the tomb. He looks much more like Adam Kraft, the hard-working medieval laborer, than Dürer, the aristocratic Renaissance genius. Although the tomb as a whole, as I said, does look Gothic, some parts of it, like this, show Renaissance touches. He stands under a round arch, for example, and there are putti playing in front of him. Maximilian had wanted to be buried in the Hofkirche in Innsbruck, his favorite city. But by the time he died in 1519, the people there had come to hate him so much that they refused to let him be buried in the city. And his body was actually interred at Wiener Neustadt in the Church of St. George. By that time, however, his colossal tomb project, which you see in Innsbruck, had been underway for years, although the statue of the emperor himself rests on top of a cenotaph, an empty tomb. Peter Fischer was in overall charge of this project, but it wasn't completed until long after his death. Around the cenotaph are 28 statues representing, as in the case of the paper arch, Maximilian's supposed ancestors and relatives. It is often claimed that in the early stages of the work here, Dürer supplied Fischer with sketches for the statues of Arthur and Theodoric the Ostrogoth, which at least influenced the way they were made, and we will see those figures in some of the other parts of the tomb now, while we hear the hymn Pro Dolor by Josquin des Prez, which was performed at Maximilian's funeral. This is King Arthur, who does look British somehow, I think. This is Theodoric the Ostrogoth, the first important king of Italy after the fall of the Roman Empire, you may remember. Here are Philip the Good and Charles the Bold, his son, the famous Dukes of Burgundy about whom we've heard, and who were the grandfather and father of Maximilian's wife Mary, and thereby the ancestors as well of all the Habsburg emperors after Maximilian himself. And here's Maximilian on top of his would-be tomb. When he died, the payment of Dürer's retainer was halted. Maximilian had not actually paid him the money himself, but required the city of Nuremberg to pay him. And even though Dürer himself was a member of the town council, it voted to discontinue the payments on the emperor's death, requiring him to get the new emperor, Maximilian's grandson Charles V, to continue the authorization. Dürer decided to attend the latter's coronation in 1520 in Aachen and approach him there when he would presumably be in a good mood. In fact, combined his visit to Aachen with something like a grand tour of Northern Europe that took about a year, and this is a sketch he made of the harbor at Antwerp. He kept a journal, which makes this one of the most well-documented periods in his life, in fact, and on this trip his wife also accompanied him. While they were in Flanders, Dürer recorded his admiration for Van Eyck's Adoration of the Lamb in Ghent, and for works he saw in Bruges and elsewhere by Van der Weyden and Van der Goes. His own reputation had preceded him, and he was treated very well everywhere he went. Here are sketches he made of two German businessmen, Paul Toppler and Martin Finzing. Dürer was especially interested in the various exotic products that were beginning to be brought back from the New World, and among the souvenirs he took back to Nuremberg were Indian arrows, a tortoise shell, pistachio nuts, and sugar cane. Among the things that impressed him the most were the examples from Cortez's Aztec loot that were on display in the Brussels Hotel de Ville at the time. He saw Van der Weyden's Justice pictures there, but was clearly more interested in the things from the New World. He also only mentions in passing seeing Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna. He also made this sketch of another fellow he met in the north. In fact, his curiosity about the natural world may have brought about his relatively early death. In attempting to see a beached whale on the coast of Holland, he got very wet and cold and was to suffer the rest of his life from pleurisy and bouts of fever, which some think were a result of his having contracted malaria during this trip. He was acting somewhat in the manner of a businessman himself while in the north. He took bales of his engravings, probably some drawings, maybe a few paintings to sell, and he made a lot of money as a result of this. In October of 1520, he did finally attend the coronation of the Emperor Charles V here in the Cathedral of Aachen, built by Charlemagne, which was the place where virtually all emperors had been crowned since Otto I's day in 936. He was to be the last crowned here, however, because his brother Ferdinand was crowned in Frankfurt, which was also the city in which the electors officially met to put their stamp of approval on each succession. Although it was extensively restored after World War II, Charles V and Durer would certainly still recognize both this building and the throne we'll see inside, which is said to go all the way back to Charlemagne's day. At the top of the picture, you can see the Rathaus or Town Hall of Aachen, which is where the palace used to be. This is a drawing Durer made of the other side of it, and this is a modern photo. Durer also made a drawing looking from the Rathaus toward the cathedral, and this is that view today. Here you can see the facade at ground level now with the original 1,200-year-old bronze doors still on it. And while we see more of this building now, we'll hear the organ piece known as Homage to Charles V, presented to the Emperor for this occasion by Arnold Schlick. This is also one of the very first pieces of music to have been published in Germany, and Schlick also wrote the earliest surviving German music specifically for the lute by saying it was one of the first to be published. I mean printed. It was one of the first pieces of music to be reproduced on a printing press. Here are those doors up closer now. And this is the interior looking east toward the 13th century chandelier and the 11th century altar. Now looking back west, you can see the throne on the second level. And here it is up closer. This is the dome, but as I said, all the mosaics are modern. And the altar up closer in front of the choir added to the church in the 14th century. And the crown made for Otto I in the 10th century, and which has crowned most emperors since. It's now in the Vienna Art History Museum. And this is probably the most well-known image of Charles V, the equestrian portrait by Titian, now in the Prado. Earlier I mentioned Durr's sympathy for what would become the Protestant viewpoint, and on his way home, he heard the rumor that Luther had been kidnapped by agents of the Pope after meeting with Charles at the Diet of Worms. This turned out, as we'll see, to be false, but Durr reacted very angrily to it in his own diary. Four years later, in 1525, the Nuremberg Town Council voted to declare Nuremberg a Lutheran city, although exactly what that meant isn't clear. In any case, Durr himself was, as I mentioned, a member of this council and presumably voted yea on the proposal, as did Hieronymus Holzschuher, whose portrait by Durr we see now. This is the most impressive painting Durr had done since he finished the Trinity altarpiece in 1511, 14 years earlier. The detail of this, the treatment of the beard and hair and the fur collar, has to remind one of the work of the 15th century Flemish painters whose work Durr would have seen on his trip to the north. It's as though he were trying to out-Van Eyck, I think. In 1526, Durr undertook his last monumental work, the two over-life-size panels now called the Four Apostles. Why these were painted is still argued over, but what we can document is that Durr presented them to the Nuremberg Town Council. It is also certainly likely that in making his presentation, Durr was thinking of the council's pro-Lutheran stance, because there's no doubt that the panels were painted from an essentially Protestant perspective. One thing which all Protestants emphasized was that the Bible had to take precedence over the Pope. And on the left, Luther's favorite evangelist, the Apostle John, who looks like Philip Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man and a friend of Durr's as well, is clearly giving St. Peter, undoubtedly representing the papacy, a lesson in Scripture. He might be pointing out that in the Gospel of John, when Christ tells the woman taken in adultery, "Go and sin no more," he doesn't say, "That'll be $100, please." Of course, Luther, the Pope, and the devil can all quote Scripture to suit their purposes. The papacy claimed to derive its authority from the Bible no less than Luther, but it is true that Protestants were, as I said, to emphasize the importance of the Bible more. Here are the two panels up closer. In the right-hand panel, St. Paul, another favorite of Luther, stands in front of the evangelist St. Mark, who was not an apostle. Why the latter is represented isn't clear, but it is Paul who says things like, "There is none without sin, and the just shall live by faith," which Protestants quoted about as often as any other scriptural passages. At the bottom of the two panels are scriptural quotations in Luther's German translation, another Lutheran touch, of course. In 1627, the city gave these panels to the Catholic Duke of Bavaria, Maximilian I, who was a great admirer of Durr's, in hopes of keeping him and his army out of Nuremberg during the 30 Years' War. He cut the quotations off the panels, clearly thinking that they were anti-Catholic, regardless of what he thought of the significance of the pictures themselves. It may be, however, that their real force, the force of the quotations, was intended to be not specifically anti-Catholic. They sound to many today to be directed against false prophets in general, which group could have been meant to include radical Protestants as well as Catholics. Durr died suddenly in 1528, though as I mentioned, he had not been altogether healthy since returning from his trip to the north. He was buried in the cemetery of the Church of St. John outside the city, where his grave can still be seen. The epitaph is by his friend Pirkheimer. "What is mortal of Albrecht Dürer" lies here. This is now the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome as it looks today. As we heard last quarter, the rebuilding of it was begun in Julius II's day by Bramante, and it proved to be a very expensive project that was not to be completed until the early 17th century. To help finance the building of it, Pope Leo X in 1517 offered indulgences, time off one's term in purgatory, for contributions. This kind of thing was not new, and it helped to pay for the building of many of the greatest churches of the Middle Ages. Urban II had also granted a plenary indulgence, a free pass-through purgatory in effect, for those who would go on his crusade. One can certainly argue that sacrifices of various sorts on behalf of the church, whether financial or otherwise, should in some way benefit the donor, but at the same time it's clear that there was a real danger in making it seem as though one could simply buy heaven's favor. This is Lucas Cranach's portrait of Cardinal Albrecht of Brandenburg, Archbishop of Mainz, posing as St. Jerome. It was expected that those newly appointed to high church offices, and especially those like Albrecht here, who held more than one such office, which required special papal authorization, would present a thank you gift to His Holiness. Albrecht offered 7,000 ducats in memory of the 7 joys of the Virgin, and Leo suggested that 12,000 in honor of the 12 apostles might be more welcome. They compromised on 10,000, presumably not, as Roland Bainton puts it, for the 10 Commandments. The essence of the matter is that to come up with the 10,000, Albrecht had to borrow them from the Fugger Bank, and was then permitted by the Pope to offer indulgences, with half of the proceeds going to the St. Peter's Fund, and half to pay off the Fuggers, though the latter provision was not widely advertised. Albrecht's chief fundraiser was to be one Johann Tetzel, whose notorious slogan, "When the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs," tells you all you need to know about his approach to marketing his product. Albert is often represented by Protestants as one of the bad guys of the Reformation, but he was in fact quite a liberal Catholic and supported many of Luther's ideas, as eventually did many other Catholics. Luther himself eventually came to regard him as a friend. Also, in Albert's defense, there was a sliding scale for the indulgences. Nobles were expected to pay in the neighborhood of $1,000 in gold, the purchasing power of which was probably equivalent to 10 times that amount, at least, while working-class men had to pay only $50, and the very poor, in theory, could contribute only prayers, since the advertisements read, "We are as much concerned with the salvation of souls as with this building." He was also a major patron of Protestant artists. Lucas Cranach, who painted the picture of him we just saw, was one of Luther's best friends, and Dürer, of course, was also a de facto Lutheran, but made this engraving in 1519, 2 years after the indulgence controversy had broken. Albert liked it so much he bought hundreds of copies. This is Frederick the Wise, Duke and Elector of Saxony, as painted by Dürer in 1496, which makes this one of Dürer's earliest commissioned portraits, and Frederick was to become, as we've heard, one of Dürer's most important customers. In principle, he had nothing against indulgences. In fact, in the Castle Church in Wittenberg, he had one of the largest relic collections in Christendom, to the veneration of which, especially on All Saints' Day, a large indulgence was attached with papal authorization. Frederick's accountants calculated that if one sincerely venerated all of the wisps of manger straw, drops of the Virgin's milk, feathers dropped by the angel Gabriel, and so on, one's term in purgatory could be reduced by a whopping 1,902,000 years, which it would seem should cover the penance due for most any earthly transgression. For reasons that are not altogether clear, he refused to allow Tetzel to enter Saxony. He may have viewed him as a threat to the business his own relics brought to Wittenberg, or he may have just been put off by Tetzel's blatantly mercenary approach. But many of his subjects crossed the border to buy Tetzel's letters of indulgence and showed them to Professor Luther at the University of Wittenberg, who did not like what he saw. This is a portrait of Luther now by Lucas Cranach. Luther was born in Eisleben, the son of a miner who eventually saved enough money to buy the mine he had worked in, and he was able to send his son Martin to school in Eisenach and then to the University of Erfurt, where he began studying law, which was just the kind of thing his father wanted. However, in 1505, when the 22-year-old Luther was returning to Erfurt after a visit to his family, he was caught in a violent thunderstorm near Staudenheim, where this monument stands. Afraid for his life, and perhaps seeing the storm as a warning from God not to become a lawyer, he prayed for help to St. Anne, vowing to become a monk if he reached Erfurt. This is the kind of vow that's often forgotten when one is safe and warm again. But when Luther made it to Erfurt, instead of returning to the university, he went into the Augustinian cloister and made good on his promise. When his father found out that his future lawyer son was now what he regarded as a worthless monk, he disowned him. Luther's ability allowed him to rise quickly in the order. In 1507 he became a priest, and in 1508 he was transferred to the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg and also assumed the post of logic teacher in the university there. In 1510 he was sent to Rome on business for the order and took advantage of the opportunity to earn the plenary indulgence offered for climbing the Scala Sancta on one's knees. These stairs, traditionally said to have been moved from Jerusalem to Rome by Constantine's mother St. Helena, back in the 4th century, are supposed to be the very ones at the top of which Pilate presented Jesus to the crowd which wanted him crucified. When Luther reached the top, however, he is said to have had his doubts about the value of what he'd done, and the value of indulgences generally, which had already begun to worry him, made even more intense. He was also appalled by the lifestyle he found prevalent among the clergy in Rome. The Renaissance was at its height. Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael was painting the Pope's apartments, and so on. But Luther mentions none of this, seeing Rome only as a nest of reptiles and as no better than a sewer. Here's the castle church in Wittenberg as it looks today. Wittenberg was renamed Lutherstadt by the communists, who regarded Luther as a social revolutionary, apparently because they never read what he said. But more about that next week. He returned to Wittenberg after his trip to Rome, and for the next 6 years continued his career as a monk, priest, and eventually also as professor of theology and provincial vicar general of the Augustinian order, while his reservations regarding indulgences and the theology on which they were based grew ever more clear and compelling. The last straw was the indulgence for contributions to the building of St. Peter's, about which we've heard. Here's the interior of the church now, and you can see the pulpit from which Luther preached in the distance on the right. He's buried below it, as we'll see next week. When people brought the letters of indulgence they had bought from Tetzel to ask his opinion of them, he said that he could not vouch for them in any way. And then on Halloween, the eve of All Saints' Day, the very day on which Frederick's Relic Festival was to be held, he put his 95 Theses on the door of the church. And on the morning of All Saints' Day, what people saw there was a polemical repudiation of the very thing they were coming to the church to engage in. Here are the modern bronze doors to the church imprinted with the theses. The Pope is richer than Croesus, says Luther. He would do better to sell St. Peter's and give the money to the poor who are being fleeced by the hawkers of indulgences. If His Holiness has the power to release people from purgatory for money, why doesn't He do it for love? Indulgences are pernicious. They impede salvation by diverting charity and inducing a false sense of security. He who spends money for indulgences instead of relieving the needs of the poor receives not the indulgence but the indignation of God. Very soon, these theses were the talk of Germany. Luther was not just some nobody monk who could be disregarded as a loudmouthed bumpkin. He was a professor of theology at a major university and vicar general of the Augustinian order in Saxony and had to be dealt with. This is the Protestant monument at Worms with Luther in the center. He first had to explain himself to the Augustinian order's leadership in Heidelberg, which he did to their satisfaction. But then a few months later he was required to meet with the Pope's emissary, Cardinal Cajetan at Augsburg, and Cajetan ordered Frederick to arrest him and send him to Rome or else banish him. Frederick, who is one of the more remarkable people of the Reformation, refused to do either, even though he remained a Catholic the rest of his life and had seen Luther insult his beloved relic collection. In 1519, Luther agreed to debate at Leipzig Johann Eck, who was professor of theology at Ingolstadt and a partisan of the papacy, and this resulted in the latter's recommendation that Luther be excommunicated. And then finally in 1521, right after his coronation, Charles V ordered Luther to meet him at Worms, where his first diet was being held, so that he could hear for himself what all the fuss was about. Here's the statue of Luther up closer now, on the side of the building in which the Diet met next to the cathedral. Charles did listen, but he was not persuaded. His response was, I think, though a good one. What he said in essence was that his family had been loyal to the Roman Church for 1,000 years, and he had resolved to follow in their footsteps, staking his blood, his life, and his soul on his faith. He said that Luther was wrong, but I think what really bothered him was his disloyalty in an age when loyalty and honor were regarded as virtues more to be valued than goodness or rightness themselves. Charles himself thought he certainly owed more loyalty to St. Peter than Dr. Luther. He did not, however, arrest Luther, giving him leave to depart, but ordering the bull of excommunication to be enforced in 3 weeks if he did not recant. Luther told him he would not recant. He told the emperor, "Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders." Here I stand, I can do nothing else. So next time we'll find out what happened to him on his way home and go on with the Reformation in Germany and in England when we get to Henry VIII.